Hi, this is Joshua Kulp. We are learning Daf Lammed Vav, page 36 of Masechet Avodah Zarah for Daf Shevui, coming to you from the conservative yeshiva. And this daf begins, and most of the daf is devoted to the prohibition of oil. Now we should notice one special feature about the prohibition of oil that comes up in the discussion. This is, of course, the prohibition of Gentile oil, Jews using oil produced by non-Jews. The one special feature of this is that this particular Zarah decree, prohibition, was rescinded sometime after the end of the Mishnaic period, and actually the rescinding of this got into some manuscripts of the Mishnah, such that in some versions of the Mishnah it too mentions that a certain court came around and annulled the prohibition of oil. But as far as the original Mishnah and the Talmud are concerned, the prohibition still stands, at least for the beginning of the Talmudic period and the entire Mishnaic period. So the beginning of the Gemara is a debate about why oil was prohibited, and this I think is a very telling, important debate because it can teach us, it's illustrative of why rabbis might decree that something that's permitted by the Torah is actually should not be consumed or should not be done. And there are two reasons. One is that there is a fear that by doing X, you're going to come to do Y, and Y is prohibited by the Torah. Okay, that's a classic understanding of Gezerah. And the other way of understanding Gezerah is the rabbis just simply want to keep people away from a certain act. It's not that by engaging in that act they're going to at least directly come to transgress a Torah law. It's just the rabbis don't want people to engage in this act. In this particular case, the prohibition of oil would be because of intermingling, perhaps intermarriage, of assimilation with non-Jews. And as we've seen, the rabbis have a program over here to protect, to guard against assimilation. This gets tied up into the issue of when can a Gezerah, a rabbinic decree, be abandoned. And this is still a topic of particular halachic interest. Really, it's part of a larger topic: when can Jewish law change? Usually, the way we think of it is that laws that come from the Bible, from the Torah, are immutable and can't change, but laws that come from the rabbis are more adaptable to change. But that's not always true. There's a statement in this Talmud and this Gemara taken from the Mishnah that certain decrees made by a court cannot be overturned unless the subsequent court is both greater in minyan, in number, and in chokhmah, in wisdom. And since we believe that later courts are never greater in wisdom, basically this Mishnah says later courts can't overturn what earlier courts did. So usually to get around that, what rabbis, both in the Talmud and post-Talmudic, will say is that this wasn't really a decree of a court, but rather it was some other process or some other issue. But in any case, I without getting into the particulars, the issue of what things are changeable and what things are not changeable is a perpetual issue in Jewish law and remains an issue to this day. Finally, when it comes to oil, there's some interesting discussion over here about why a later court decided to rescind the prohibition of oil. And here it's also a telling example. It's because people just didn't abide by this prohibition. In other words, according to the rabbinic imagination, some early rabbis, we don't know who, or some early Jewish figure of authority said Jews should not have oil that belongs to non-Jews. And Jews just simply didn't observe this prohibition. And since it wasn't observed, it basically lost its ability to guide Jewish lives. And that's, I think, an interesting process, too. This sort of power that's given to popular observance. When things aren't done, they're just considered not to be valid anymore, and later on, no one really has to keep them. It doesn't happen often, but this does seem to be what happened with the oil prohibition. Interesting why Jews didn't observe that. One of my guesses is that oil is so ubiquitous, and it's not really a food. You don't break oil with people like you break bread. You don't share a cup of oil with people like you share a cup of wine. And therefore, they probably didn't see any real reason to the prohibition of oil, and therefore they abandoned it. The second half of the daf is really a series of gzeirot, that they prohibited this, lest one come to do this, lest one come to do this, lest one come to do this, all ultimately seeming to be fears of assimilation. I think what's interesting in this passage is there are classifications of different prohibitions. They're trying to classify what's dioraita, what's prohibited by the Torah. I would argue that's essential, an essential part of Judaism. What is more ancient? And what is the historical background to subsequent layers of Jewish law? The sugya gets into the prohibitions of sexual relations with non-Jews, which brings us to the still hot topic of intermarriage. There are various aspects discussed. Is there a difference between male Jew with female non-Jew versus female Jew with male non-Jew? Are there differences in the prohibition of marriage, or is it just sex that's prohibited? What about public, private? What about being secluded, alone in a room? All sorts of manifestations of these issues. I'll conclude by noting that the Talmud's interest in prohibiting intermarriage probably is in the background that Jews were intermarrying in this period. It doesn't seem that rabbis would have paid such particular attention to a phenomenon that wasn't occurring. But I do think that, I'm going to tell it like I see it, is that the rabbis did not condone intermarriage. They clearly wanted to prevent it. I think that they feared cultural assimilation. They were living in a world of majority Greco-Romans, and they clearly feared that their way of life would be lost if people intermarried. I know very well that this is still a big topic for Jews, especially in the diaspora, in the United States and in parts of Europe and in Canada, indeed throughout the English-speaking world. I'm not going to say my opinion. This is not really what I do on these podcasts, but I do think that it's interesting to see these texts as being somewhat relevant to discussions that still go on today, because they lived in a period that has a relatively large similarity, I think, to the period in which we live in.